Hey, everybody. Before we start the show, I just wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Kobold Press. Kobold Press are the makers of fine 5th edition D&D products like the Creature Codex, which you're going to hear all about in this podcast, and 12 Peculiar Towers, which is a collection of 5th edition adventures for characters levels 1 to 13 with the theme of, you guessed it, towers. Discover the mysteries that lie within the forest lair of Ravenfolk bandits, a magical archive of ancient elven lore, the hideout of a powerful thieves guild master, the stronghold of a sinister blood mage, and more. Each tower comes with a beautifully illustrated map, including many isometric maps, and of course plenty of traps, hazards, and enemies to challenge your players. You can get 12 Peculiar Towers in print and PDF at koboldpress.com. That's koboldpress.com. Tell them DSPN sent you. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, I am talking about one of my favorite subjects, monsters, with two of my favorite people, Meagan Maricle and Chris Harris. We are talking about specifically some monsters in the Creature Codex, this amazing book that just came out from Kobold Press. I helped design a bunch of monsters in it, but we get into a lot of awesome monster design conversation, and we cover stuff you have not heard before. So get excited. Here we go. Okay, everybody, now I am here with two amazing individuals in the tabletop RPG industry. Let's meet them. We are going to talk about monsters. Meagan, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
I am Meagan Maricle, and I edit monsters and other things, primarily for Kobold Press at the moment, but I've worked with a handful of other companies, and my latest and greatest work so far is the Creature Codex by Kobold Press, where I'm the lead editor and developer.
Excellent. Well, it is awesome to have you here. That is a beautiful book, The Creature Codex, and I'm not just saying it because I helped make some of the creatures. And Chris, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
I am Chris Harris. I'm a game designer primarily for Kobold Press. I've worked for a couple of other companies here and there, but Kobold Press is home. I've been with them since about 2011. I do a lot of things. Primarily these days it's been making monsters and working on a couple of larger adventures right now as well. And probably the largest project, Tome of Beasts and Creature Codex. I think I've submitted like 95 creatures to each of those roughly. So I think those are the two big ones.
Yeah, I've heard of those. Those are some nice books that you've worked on. So,
oh yeah, I enjoyed the corpse mound of yours quite a bit. Actually, that was a good piece of work. I like that.
Oh, thank you. That was my my breakthrough with Kobold Press was writing the corpse mound as a backer of the Tome of Beasts. So that was really
fantastic.
Fun. Yeah. So, and I had a lot of fun making some monsters for the Creature Codex. So, we're going to talk about monster design. We've talked about it a lot on this podcast, and it's so deep. There's always new stuff to uncover. It's a huge topic, and it's really important, not just for people who want to get into the design game professionally, but also for people who are just running games at their table. It's fun to make monsters for your players to attack and to interact with the world in different ways, because monsters are more than just sacks of hit points the players need to overcome. So how do you get good ideas for monsters, Chris?
Of late, and with Creature Codex, the seeds of them were actually handed to me, to be perfectly honest, which is we had a list that Wolfgang had compiled of, it's not every monster that's in there, but quite a lot of them that were in there came from a spreadsheet that had a name for a monster and then 2 or 3 words or so to sort of give you a hint about what the thing was. I think I mentioned earlier that one of my favorites said something like lives in corn, looks like a wolf for one creature. And that one I think became the Roga Wolf. Let's see, if I'm not picking the coolest looking things off of a list, then doing a kind of deep dive research on that, then really I pull from ideas from anything from like relative to me, obscure folklore or scary environment things, places and situations that sound kind of terrifying to me, and then what would step that up a notch, being faced with a particular thing in that environment. There's a writer named Clark Ashton Smith that keeps coming to mind with that. Wrote a short story in which someone was rowing down the Amazon, stopped at the wrong little ruin and encountered this plant that wound up killing him, but not before turning him into a giant shrub, in effect, as he went sailing further down the river, and that was the end of him. So things like that. I like freaky environments and things that work well in those environments, and then obscure folklore things. And Kobold Press is a great place for that, running off the beaten path of fantasy and folklore.
Definitely. And I think that's a fascinating thing, right? Is a lot of these monsters we're seeing aren't necessarily just plucked out of the brain of a designer. They're drawn from folklore or that sort of thing, which to me is a hard challenge because someone somewhere knows that monster well, and you're trying to do justice to that monster, but also bring it to life through the mechanics. Do you find yourself when you've got one line like that says looks like a wolf raised in, or hides in corn, how much extra research are you doing? And then what do you do when you find that there are conflicting folklore reports, right? Because these aren't real creatures. So in one part of a culture, the story might go, this creature can do X, Y, and Z. And in another, it might be, well, like, really, they can also do A, B, and C, or they can only do A, B, and C. How do you work that out?
Really, and the thing that comes to mind with that is, I mean, I was born and raised in Texas, and a big one here, the jackalope. And there are so many different takes on the jackalope, and they're all interesting. But they vary wildly from great big ones that you could ride around to little bitty ones living in packs. And really, you have to kind of eventually decide which of those things do you like the most? Which of those things appeal to you as a storyteller, or that you think your players will respond to the most? It's kind of funny when it's something that draws out of a myth or folklore from 6,000 to 600 years ago. I will have a little twinge of guilt almost when I decide, like, okay, this particular corn wolf thing is now going to be focused on this one aspect from this one story out of 10. Sorry, guy from, the dark ages that really thought it was this other way. But no disrespect. There's so many great ideas tied to those things, and sometimes, though, you have to kind of, I would think, to find it scary or interesting, be pretty immersed in the cultural context the creature comes from. Like if you're not literally growing corn, some of those things might not be frightening to you at all, and if you can't pull that part into the story and communicate it to players, then you should probably toss that and grab something else from it. In reverse, actually, reading quite a bit about spirits in Inuit culture, which I will tell you right now I know next to nothing about, but only recently started reading about. And it really sort of trying to find things that worked as undead in that cultural context is very, very different, because there tends to not be in their folklore this fear associated with that. It's not necessarily a negative thing if the spirit of your ancestor is actually manifesting and communicating with you, or even being a part of who you are. Back to the main question, it would be finding the thing, the core thing that will get across to players and that will also appeal to a DM when they're reading it. I love digging into things like that, though. I could sit and go down a rabbit hole learning about Basque mythology that I knew nothing about the day before and be a happy camper for the rest of my life doing nothing but that.
So, you do the research, you create the monster. Meagan, you then get these monsters that are based in folklore and that sort of thing. When you're taking a monster that's based in folklore like that and you're editing it together, how much research are you doing? When you get something that it's like, hey, this is based on, you have the same two lines about the corn and the wolf. What do you do?
I actually don't get to see those little snippets, right? I get the full creature, like once the designer's done with it. But a lot of creatures, like you can usually tell when a designer's pulled them from folklore, or the designer will straight up tell you, hey, this is from such and such folklore. So I usually do a little bit of research to make sure that the creature, that the folklore remains intact. So if we're going to go around the wolf route, Chris actually had one for Creature Codex that was the Fang of the Great Wolf, that's based off of Fenris from Norse mythology. And with that one, I went up and looked, because I don't know a ton about Norse mythology. I know a little bit, like I know a little bit more than what the Marvel movies show, but that's about it, right?
Right, they're aliens, right? That's what I think I remember.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Because the mythology I've always liked is Greek mythology. So it's interesting working with these monsters from different folklore, because then it's like, oh, goodness, I have to go read other folklore now. So I read a lot about Fenris. I'm like, this is a really, really interesting creature, I suppose. With the whole swallowing the world and all of that stuff. But that was one where I looked up the folklore of the creature, and I saw the creature that Chris had presented. And I was like, hey, there's some cool stuff mentioned here in Fenris's folklore about him like swallowing the world. Can we do that? Right? So I worked with Chris on that one, where I was like, hey, look, there's this really cool thing in his lore and in his history. Let's see if we can bring that as a mechanic. And we did. We worked together, and the Fang of the Great Wolf now has an ability that, like, once per day, it can get like really big and swallow people. So it goes from being like a normal size, wolf, to being like this really big wolf that goes around swallowing people. And it's something minor, right? But it kind of calls back to that Fenris folklore.
And is a fantastic addition to it, honestly, too. That creature was something when I first started. I think I actually cooked that up for an article originally on the Kobold Press site, and the original idea was a warg that was going to be a priest or priestess of Fenris. It morphed over time into that, because by the time we're doing Creature Codex, it's pretty much like, okay, it's a warg with some spellcasting abilities. It's not that fascinating anymore. And, especially when it's got, 4 or 5 other, similar creatures in that, how many different things that are basically a big wolf can you have that, aren't that dissimilar? And yeah, that was a great addition, actually.
Yeah, well, I think it makes it stand out too, among other wargs. Like you're saying, it's not just a warg with spellcasting.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it improved it a great deal, and was something that, just did not occur to me at all to go further into the Fenris material for better stuff for some reason. But honestly, though, I have to say, too, that Creature Codex is my favorite, I think, project that I've worked on, period, at this point, exclusively because of the interaction with editing.
You're going to make me blush, Chris. Stop it.
No, really, though, it's quite often not as anyone's fault, but just as, how things get rolling when a project really gets rolling. You don't really have that much communication. You'll turn things over, and you might get an email, this needs to be corrected or something like that, but you don't get to spitball ideas at all, or not very much. A lot of that has to do with probably the size of the project and number of people turning things in, and editor being totally swamped. But yeah, and on this one in particular, Meagan was fantastic with that. In fact, I was even kind of probably overdoing the back and forth a little bit here and there. It's just because of the novelty of it. To me, it was so great. The way things come up in the process that you don't originally intend when you have that kind of input is fantastic.
Yeah, I only recently found out that that's not normal. Because I mean, I come from a background of editing like fiction, and the editor and the author usually work really closely on that to make sure that, hey, your story is correct. If in chapter 1 his eyes are blue, in chapter 10 they better still be blue. If they're not, there's got to be a reason. So there's a lot of back and forth, and then I get into this. I'm like, all right, cool. I'm going to talk to the designers. And it's like, wait, what? Why are you? I'm like, what do you mean? Why am I? It's their thing. Let's make this cool together.
No, and that's fantastic. Partially, too, you wind up with, I don't know if this is true of everyone, but this particular game designer, when there is no real response until much further down the road, imposter syndrome kicks in, and you're sitting there going like, did I just totally screw that whole thing up? Like, nobody wants to say anything, until eventually, oh no, it's in the book still, so I guess it was good. So it's that back and forth is great. And I'm trying to remember, there was one creature in particular.
Was it the Quiet Soul?
Yes, yeah, the name changed like 4 times. That thing. And you guys were totally right about it too. But my original version of it had no movement speed. And that was partially because it was almost creature as trap, in that it was something that you might find in an igloo, out on a glacier, and wander in, and, you're already a couple of levels into exhaustion and don't really notice that this one particular dead body inside the thing, of people who look like they starved or what have you, died of exposure, that one of them in particular is actually a ghost slowly sucking the life out of everyone in the room.
Well, and that's an example too, where the folklore was really, really cool, but bringing it into game mechanics, some of it had to be changed and toned down, right? Because in the folklore, it is that, right? It's just, it's. I think you said that's part of the Inuit stuff, I believe, in their folklore of just, it's this body that, is someone who was abandoned and died, and so that kind of creates this aura of really bad stuff nearby and makes more people die near them. And
I think I mostly just pulled that one out of thin air to some degree, but I borrowed an Inuit word and attached it to it that I can't pronounce. But it means despises others, and which I thought was great that they had a word just for that. Oh no, and you were absolutely right about it. I sat there for maybe a couple of hours or a day going like, but it doesn't need to move, and then okay, yeah, it probably does.
Yeah, and that was another one, though, where the playtest feedback, too, really helped out, because playtesters were like, yeah, I would like it to move. That'd be cool. And I'm like, all right, well, Chris, even playtest is like, can it move? Because one DM was like, yeah, so, like, my ranger just kind of sat back and shot it with arrows, and then that was a good game. So can we do something different with this?
Yeah, and because I'm picturing the perfect scenario for its use in my head when I'm writing it.
Like falling into a pit and it's there and you can't climb out kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, or your igloo's too big, man. The ranger shouldn't be able to do that.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you cannot, you have to design for usability, versatility.
Exactly. And that's why an editor is so important, right? Meagan, we just worked together on some creatures for the old Margrave, and that was also more back and forth than I've ever had with an editor in a great way, and definitely saved some creatures that in the beginning I was like, oh, but they need to be able to do this. And Meagan was like, well, what are you going for here, right? Like, what are you trying to do? And let me help you get there, and let me show you the way. This is what I would do. And those conversations were so helpful, and ultimately elevated the product of what we had. You start, I think, sometimes as a designer with this is how I would use this creature in my head. This is how this works. This is, as long as you do this, it'll be fine, right? That's not how role-playing games work. That's not where the fun of playing role-playing games is. And so I think we sometimes fancy ourselves as movie writers, right? When we're writing adventures and monsters and things. And it's like, yeah, but you're role-playing game designers. You need to think bigger and wider and broader. And editors are very, very helpful for that. In addition to adding the coolness, that idea of like, hey, what if we take this wolf that just seems kind of like a magic warg and make it get big once a day? That takes a creature from, oh, it's a warg, to, wow, this is really terrifying. And the next time, every wolf we run into from now until the end of the campaign will be throwing rocks at from very far away to see if they get big.
Right, because it might be a wolf that becomes the size of a Volkswagen. Yeah. No, and that's a very good description there about picturing yourself as a filmmaker or something with that creature. And and they are great in that context of that little movie you have in your head. But in reality, yeah, what we're actually doing would be closer to designing characters or something in a film to hand over to another filmmaker to do whatever the hell they want with. And yeah, having to think of that guy too, those people, and yeah, and I am definitely one of those people that needs that and get great stuff back from it. The horned serpent was another one we actually talked about through email recently. That playtest actually tightened up quite well, but that was something I went digging into several Native American mythology from several different places around the U.S. had this creature, a horned serpent, like a giant snake with a gem in its head, some sort of a stone in its head. And the primary thing when I was reading up on it that jumped out at me is that it makes you sick. It spreads illness was the thing they were most afraid of with this creature. But the horns never really came up except as sort of a decorative item on the thing. And then in playtest, I guess the response Meagan got back was, hey, why can't this thing do a headbutt? It's a giant snake with big horns on it.
Yeah, the DMs are like, it has horns. Why are the horns not a thing? And I was like, that's a good question. Let's go talk to Chris.
Yeah, that was a fantastic question because I was like, yeah, and especially, yeah, if it strikes like a snake, that'd be a pretty devastating headbutt. And why didn't I think of that? And, it's okay. Also, yeah, disease. But I kind of love the way things like that come together in a process like that. We probably shouldn't focus so much on, the novelty of Meagan interacting because she might stop doing it as much.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that, Meagan. Like, you said you just learned recently it's more like authors turn their stuff over and that's it. Are you, as an editor, do you enjoy that back and forth, or would you much rather just be like, I have the fiat and I am going to change this work and this is what it'll be because this is the better way to do things? And often that's a matter of time, right? Like, we have to do it this way because of speed, not because editors are power hungry monsters, which is what I just made it out to be like.
I personally love the back and forth for many different reasons. The biggest reason being that I just think it makes the creature a much better, well-rounded creature in the end, right? When you've got multiple eyes looking at it and working on it. I mean, that's kind of the power of playtest too. And we can't necessarily always playtest every tiny little change we want to make, but I like the collaborative effort of it all. That's probably my favorite part as an editor is being that kind of like, yeah, you got this. This looks awesome, but what about this little thing over here, I was told that I might be spoiling designers, so I don't know, but no, I like it. And as far as a time thing, for the most part, I'm given deadlines ahead of time. So I always make sure that I schedule my editing in such a way that I have at least a week or a week and a half to give something back to the designer, get their feedback on it before my deadline is due. So it requires a lot of finagling, and it doesn't always work perfectly. Like, there was one of Chris's creatures in this book that we weren't able to go back to Chris on because it ended up going through, I think, 2 or 3 rounds of playtest. And by the time we got down to the wire, it's like, okay, we either need to get rid of this creature or we have to fix it. And Wolfgang's like, we got to find a way to fix it. I don't want to get rid of it. So I had to make a lot of changes to it last minute to get it out to print because we were down to the last minute on that one. And I'm not a huge fan of doing that. I think that is the only creature in the Creature Codex I did that on, other than the backer monsters. The backer monsters, just because there were like 55 different backers that submitted monsters. There's 500 people submitted, but 55 of them went in. I wasn't able to communicate with all of them about a lot of that. So my focus at that point was to look at their concept and make sure that their concept was fully realized and not squashed at any point.
And that creature that you couldn't let Chris work on was the Swollbald, right? That's what it was.
No, that one was actually designed by Sean Merwin because it was we had 10 commissioned monsters. and it was one of the commissions. So somebody paid us to do it, right? Because that was an upper tier of the backer stuff. So there were 10 people, we only had 10 slots for it, who paid an extra amount to be like, hey, here's our like one sentence about our creature, you guys make it. And Sean took care of all of that, and the Soul Bolt was one of them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that one. When I didn't even know it was in there until the book came out, and I have to say, like, if I'm completely honest, my initial reaction was, what? And then 5 seconds later, I was laughing my head off, and I love the thing. I'm going to put it in something. But
yeah, that one was awesome.
That was pretty fantastic.
But no, the creature I'm talking about is the Ratfolk Mercenary.
Oh, yeah, that thing.
It was the Ratfolk Assassin, I believe, was the original iteration of it.
Yeah.
And then after the first 2 rounds of playtest feedback, or the first round of playtest feedback, we had Chris rework it. We had to go through a second round of playtest feedback, and people were still like, this is stupid. And I was like, well, that's kind of harsh, guys. But I think the most constructive feedback was that it didn't feel any different or unique.
Yeah.
And then some of the other feedback just from some of the other people that were working on the book at the time were just like, hey, we've got like 6 assassins in this book. Can we like rename something so we don't just have this assassin, this assassin, this assassin?
Yeah. And the funny thing about that particular creature, now that we're talking about it, I remember it vividly, was that when it was added onto the list, the reference for it, I believe, was to an adventure that someone was writing that was in process. And there was that one and another Ratfolk creature. And I was really unsure what was being looked for there, if it was something that had to fit into this adventure that was being written and therefore should be basically an NPC type thing, or basically taking the Ratfolk player race, our version of it, and adding the character levels to it to make basically an assassin out of a Ratfolk. And I remember it being like feeling really hesitant about messing with it too much, because I was thinking it was somebody else's, a part of someone else's adventure, and not wanting to go crazy on it. I don't know. But yeah, I do remember that. I remember having a weird bit of anxiety about the Ratfolk.
Yeah, it was put into the Codex layers that Sean Merwin did, and I think that might have been what they told you when you were told that it was going to be in something, because Sean Merwin did our Codex layers, and one of those layers is like a continuation of the Riverfront Rat Gang, I think is what it's called. It's an adventure that's in the Book of Layers.
Okay, yeah.
So the Codex layers has that kind of continuation, and I believe the assassin shows up in that one.
Okay.
If I remember correctly.
That's awesome.
So I think that's probably what they were talking about on that front.
No, I'm glad it came out the way it did, though, too, because that was something that was bothering me, and it was so at the last minute too.
Yeah, it was like, that was one thing that playtest feedback just universally was like, whatever, I wouldn't use it. And I'm like, yeah, but if you're going to use it, then why should we put it in the book, right?
Hey, everybody, just wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Genuine Fantasy Press. Genuine Fantasy Press is giving away a free version of their new book, The Compendium of Forgotten Secrets Awakening, at genuinefantasypress.com. The book is for 5th edition D&D, and the free version includes all of the player content. It's 125 pages containing 34 new subclasses, 17 new warlock patrons and familiars, over 175 new spells and invocations, 10 new races, and the full-length version has over a dozen campaign hooks and more content to put in. The full-length version is 190 pages. The book is designed to work with both classic and homebrew settings and gives you new ideas for your world and your game. There's beautiful, beautiful full-color art. It is incredible, and it is available internationally in hardcover on Amazon. It makes an amazing holiday gift. So go check it out at genuinefantasypress.com. Inspiring adventure. All right, back to the show. One of the hard things about monster design is it feels like there is a monster for everything, that you could go to one of these amazing books that you all have put together and reskin or that sort of thing. And sometimes you want to come up with something totally unique totally original. Even if it is based on folklore, you want the mechanics to feel unique and interesting. How do we achieve that without totally also then breaking the game, right? I think there's that sort of balance is really hard. And that is another place where designers and editors work really well together to achieve that balance. So how do we look for opportunities to make something cool and unique that is balanced?
I have to kind of, I mean, this will sound more negative than I mean it to, but like having worked on a couple of different game systems now, there, I think any game system is going to be like an imperfect tool set to get an idea across, as you're having to do it mechanically within certain confines. So you're having to find a way to make it fit, at least in the larger box, if not in all the tiny little boxes within it. And that can be tricky when you have pretty bizarre idea that you're working with, whether or not it's yours or, something from the Philippines, or, thinking of, what was it, a particular creature, the Astral Snapper, I think, that started out as a Burbalang. That guy, that one in particular was strange because it's a thing that lives in the astral plane. But if you look into the folklore, it lives in the astral plane and basically eats its way through your organs. It eats corpses, but it required having to tie in, how D&D handles the astral plane and astral projection with some undead material.
And James was asking too about balance as well. And if we're talking about the Astral Snapper, the original design of that creature, in fitting with the folklore, was kind of a save or die situation. The creature would jump into you. It hangs out in the astral plane and just eat you from the inside out.
Everybody's favorite save or die situation. So done. You're ready to go.
Totally.
It's there. Boom.
Yeah. And I personally am not a fan of save or die situations. I like I'm the merciful DM that gives my players the chance to hang themselves. I love Grimtooths, right? But you got to give them a few chances, because if they're able to make the saves and they still die, they're like, well, I just can't roll today. Rather than, man, DM, you're a dick, right? So, and for the Astral Snapper too, it's a CR3. So for me, I was like, save or die at CR3. People are gonna hate their DM. This is not cool. So we did a few tweaks to it. But yeah, it was a delicate balance trying to keep that folklore, but then also making sure that mechanically it's not going to completely wreck a game at its CR. Now, if it had been like CR 15 or something and it was a save or die, I'm like, you guys kind of deserve it. I mean, the fighter's got Indomitable Will. You
had a
can
good
do
run.
this.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's another thing too, is that how you approach this particular game versus how you might do with some other games, as say, horror games or Call of Cthulhu or something like that, where that, save or die might be a lot more okay.
The players are expecting it in situations like Call of Cthulhu and stuff.
Yeah, it's a whole other kind of a game. So coloring within those lines, you do want to operate within the confines of what works, certainly, and what people will enjoy, feel challenged by, feel maybe afraid of, but not so much that they just want to chuck your book out the window. I love the process of getting to the final thing, from the starting point to that, and all the changes. Even the ones you want to buck against a little bit, because the thing, in a way, the more you work on it, the more it kind of becomes your baby in a way, and then things have to change. You're like, but shucks, but then the end result comes out so much better than you intended, or set out with anyway. You always intend for good. I was watching this ridiculous thing the other day. It was just like a piece of old 60s TV. And it was James Brown on some variety show. And he was singing, dancing. And I had this thought that, you could have entered this guy in a dance contest, but then confined him to a phone booth, and he would have still won. Just the moving around, his particular style, he didn't have to be all over the place. He could do it within these little confines. And I don't know, for some reason that stuck in my head of the comparison jumped out of nowhere that, if you can operate within the phone booth of the rule set, but, still use the space there is to go crazy in. Can be tricky, but I mean, I think we did a pretty good job of that with Creature Codex.
Well, I think the confines also help you pull more of the uniqueness out too. Because James, you were asking about uniqueness and allowing there to still be balance. And I mean, you look at different things like one of the biggest that comes to my mind is the Ratatosk Warlord that Chris did. It had all these little things in its lore about how it was bigger than the other Ratatosk, and it kind of pushed them around, and it was all like, "Ha, listen to me." And I was like, we could bring that into the mechanics, and so he's got an ability called "I'm bigger." That's why. Right. And it's a small thing, right? Like he gets to boss around nearby Ratatosk. And that ability, that trait really has no function if he's just by himself against the party, right? But if there are other Ratatosk around, it increases the challenge and then also gives it that kind of unique thing. So you're bringing the flavor, the personality of that creature into its actual mechanics.
Yeah. Well, and that's a big part of monster design, right? Like we spend a lot of time when we talk about monster design as designers focusing on the stat block and the mechanics and that sort of thing. But just as important is the text that comes before the stat block, right? That introduces the monster, that gives you the history. And what I really like that 5th edition has done is all of the story hooks about how you can use this monster. It's a way to be the director a little bit more and get to continue this film metaphor that I've started us on. It's a way to say, this might be the typical place where you find these things, and this is typically how they act. All kinds of stuff that maybe isn't necessarily in the stat block. And I find that is like sometimes harder for me to write than the stat block itself. I don't know, and I love writing it. I really enjoy it. But what do you think, Chris?
Actually, I'm completely the opposite. Actually, the easiest stuff for me quite often is the sort of adventure seeds in the text, in the descriptive text, and I really enjoy writing that material. And then there are designers that are much better than me at the stat block part of it, at going crazy with it, and yet not breaking the game. But the part I really enjoy the most is that descriptive text, the storytelling, and the adventure seeds you're putting in there. Yeah, in other things too, actually, in setting books, it's always been the adventure seeds that I really enjoy putting in there.
That's kind of the beauty of 5th edition as well, too, with their traits and how traits work and their action economy and things like that. It allows you to kind of create these unique abilities, like that Ratatosk. He's got the trait "I'm bigger." That's why that might never come up, or it might be the core focus, right? But then you've got the different actions that they can take. They can also make them unique. Just the name of the action can make it unique. Like going back to that Ratfolk mercenary, right? He's got, oh goodness, I have to look him up real quick. I know he's got a reaction that allows him to protect somebody. So it's really no different than like the Shield Guardian shield ability, right? Like the Shield Guardian can be like, "Hey, I'm going to help this guy that I'm next to." But the mercenary is called "Guard the Big Cheese," right? So it works the same way. It's like, "Hey, I'm giving a +2 AC to the guy next to me," but just the names and stuff like that kind of add extra flavor to the creatures. So you can, with the trait mechanic and just with naming things and how the actions work in 5th edition, you can make something extremely unique while still staying within the confines of the rules.
Totally. And it also, those headers and stuff are great for quick reads, right? Because especially if you can come up with something snappy like "Guard the Big Cheese," you instantly as a DM see that after you've prepared for a game and you remember, yeah, that's how that works. This is what they're doing. This is how they should be acting. This is what's going on right now in the scenario. And that is so helpful it's almost like when you sit down to design a creature, you make your outline with those little subheadings, right?
Yeah, you certainly can. I have to say with the Ratatosk, my favorite thing, after a while, and maybe it's just me and I'm getting old or something, but like you work on X number of creatures, things blur and get foggy for you after not a very long period of time. And then going back over it, there's my favorite part of that particular creature is the bit where it does not have the same access to information and communication through the world tree that the smaller Ratatosk has. And so what it winds up doing is constantly bothering them for information. The smaller ones, what's going on, what's being said, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what'd they say? What'd they say? And I don't even know if I wrote that now looking at it. I'm like, if I did, that was cool. I like that. But I'm wondering if someone didn't add it later. Oh, great. I've earned a fan. But yeah, stuff like that, though. Those little details are fun.
Well, and I think the art helps bring everything together too, right? Because you got this cool, the lore bits and everything like that. You bring some of that lore down into the actual creature, and then we get as mechanics, and then we get the extra added fun bonus because we're not just DMs at home making creatures, of actually seeing this stuff come to life in the art. And so, like the Kobold, right? I think 50% of what sold people on the Kobold, aside from its name, was the art. Right, like the artist did a really good job of looking at making somebody that looked like a gym rat.
Yeah,
but as a kobold, right?
Yes.
So that really sells that creature, and I think a lot of the art, like in Creature Codex, really helps with that. So just from the between the image and the lore and the stat block, you have this whole really cohesive creature with a lot of these.
Oh yeah, that particular the art for the Swobold, all it needs is like a white baseball cap and to be picking a fight at 2 a.m. at a Whataburger,
Oh yeah.
I love it.
When you work with people who are working with like wholly original monsters like the Swobold, right? Which is sort of a joke, but also that's one of the things that I like to do is I try to challenge myself to like, what can I come up with that's different or unique or whatever, and certainly nothing is new under the sun. As soon as I write it and send it off to the world, somebody's like, it's like these three things that you really like and you just combined in your head, and you're like, oh right, I guess I did do that. But when you get something, Meagan, that's totally new, or that is supposed to be a joke, kind of like the Swobold, but also then is supposed to fit in this compilation of creatures, many of which are meant to be taken seriously. How do you make that all work together, especially when you're looking at the project as a whole, when we as designers tend to be compartmentalized, working on just our little parts of the project?
Well, a lot of it is falling back on the rule system, definitely. I mean, because 5e's got a good foundation, so you know that you've always got like your foundation and your, I guess, skeleton of your house, right? You just have to make sure that the muscles and the tendons and everything connects correctly. The Swobold, I mean, a lot of that you can attribute to Sean Merwin, right? And it's not just the Swobold. He had another one in there. The Water Horse was another one. I don't know what kind of prompt he got, but he turned, let's do a dude with a horse head and turn it into an actual legitimate creature. So I think that was extremely impressive that he did a really good job with that. I don't know if he was told that it was based on folklore or if he looked up folklore about it, but he did a wonderful job, and then the art on that really kind of sealed that one. So instead of being the classic, I'm the guy walking around with the horse head mask, you actually got a really, really cool creature.
Oh, yeah, I know the one you're talking about now. Yeah.
Right? Like, because when I first edited that, I was like, is this just a dude with a horse head? Did somebody seriously, like, submit this to us?
One more guy with a horse head. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, and the thing is he had the folklore name for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite possible that whoever submitted it to us actually did give the folklore name for it. And maybe they were tired of seeing people walk around with horse head masks, and maybe they're really big in Irish folklore, and they're like, no, that's a legitimate thing. You people need to stop making fun of it. Here, I'm going to show you guys. I'm going to make sure that Kobold Press puts it in their book. Right? Like, I mean, it could have been that situation. I did not see those prompts. I just saw the final result, and I'm like, you know what, Sean, this is beautiful. But as far as creatures that I had to work on and make happen, the biggest example of that would probably be the giant shark bull ooze.
Oh yeah, that thing.
That was a backer monster.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
And for people who don't know, I think you need to describe what the giant shark bull ooze is, even, because that is hard to imagine.
The artwork is amazing on that one. But essentially, it's, imagine like a goldfish bowl, but it's an ooze, and instead of a goldfish, it's a shark. And when that creature first came to us, it was like the judges were like, this is a really cool creature, let's do it. And I was like, are you guys serious? Like, this is one of the backer monsters we're going to take? we're going to take this one. Okay. Out of the 500 submissions, you guys want the shark in a bowl. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the judges picked what they liked. So I was like, all right, I guess we'll run with it. So then I had to take what the backer gave us. And he had it, or he or she, I'm not sure who the original designer was on it. The designer had it as almost as like it was two creatures sharing the same space and had rules for sharing space and all of that. And I was like, F it. We're doing something new. You don't need that. It's its own creature. So I ended up reworking it to be more like, because I go back and look at, okay, so what's already been published, right? Like, so what already exists that's similar to this, and let's see if we can kind of like piecemeal this new creature out of what already exists. So it's like pulling apart the other things and making a new one. Once again, that's what's amazing about 5e's trait system, is that you can just pull traits from all kinds of different creatures and make a whole new one, which is what I love about the Zen Absorber. That was another backer commission monster. That's one of my favorites as far as like being a DM. And it's kind of like a guideline almost of how do you create a creature. Just look at the Zen Absorber and how it mechanically works. And that's how you create a creature. But the Shark Bowl Ooze, I ended up reworking it to be more like a gelatinous cube, right? It kind of like absorbs people and gets on top of them and everything like that. And then the shark part comes in because the shark on the inside is eating them. So instead of it being like, oh, they're melting from acid, it's no, you're getting eaten by a shark while you're inside of there. So it allowed it to still feel the way that the designer wanted it to feel while remaining within the rules of the book. I mean, I personally probably would have chosen a different name for it, so it isn't so obvious that it's a giant shark in a bowl. But the artist made it look like a goldfish bowl, complete with a little cute little castle and treasure chest.
Yeah.
I was like, you know what? F it, we're already in this far. Let's do it.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just have to kind of roll with it and just make sure that, at least mechanically the creature works really well.
Yeah, the minute that was another one, the first time I saw it, my initial response was to laugh. And then a little while later thinking about, what cool use you might you might make of it, say, guarding the big bad's, gallery. And it's one more little thing you're walking past thinking, oh, look, he's got a little aquarium with a shark in it, and on your way to loot the place, and then lo and behold, and it's weird the things that will get traction all of a sudden that will kind of blow your mind in the moment, and then later like, oh well, apparently that was a great idea. It's just a great idea that didn't grab my brain in the outset.
It's funny. I think it's incredible. We talk a lot about these monsters, but they also did gain a lot of traction, right? On social media, people were talking about the Swobold and the giant shark bowl ooze as soon as the Creature Codex PDFs were sent out and there were pictures being shared and that sort of thing. So I think like there's something to be said if you're trying to sell a book to include a weird monster like that, a joke monster almost, and make sure it works really well. Because if you have a monster like that, but it doesn't really play well at the table, well, then it's like, well, I could just Google image search this, right? I don't need to buy a whole book. But when it actually works well, there is really something to be said for it.
Yeah. What is that? I think Frog God Games has a similar sort of thing that worked really well for them, which is the Rapinathuk, their mega dungeon. The first thing you always hear about it is don't go down the well. Because apparently down the well, I guess the well was a latrine, and down in the well there's some sort of a poop golem or something to that effect, and it's like the last way you want to get killed. And what's funny is the notion itself sounds completely goofy, but man, you can see that stuff on T-shirts sometimes. The don't go down the well thing really got around, and probably sold a whole lot of that mega dungeon or the parts of it that they've broken it into.
Right. Well, and that's one thing that Wolfgang mentioned too. When I was like, "Hey, some of these things are a little goofy. Is that all right?" Right? Like I didn't know I really didn't know the boundaries of what Kobold Press wanted. And Wolfgang said, no, actually, we got a lot of feedback, a lot of positive feedback from Tome of Beasts, and people liked the silly stuff in it as well as the more serious stuff. So then it was okay that we have a creature in here that has an ability called Guard the Big Cheese, right? It's okay that we have a giant shark bowl ooze in here, because we also have other creatures that aren't quite as zany or whatever, or have a little bit darker lore and history and as far as what they do. So it makes a nice blend. And apparently, according to Wolfgang, there was a lot of positive feedback about that. People really liked having that kind of mixture of some of the goofy stuff with some of the much more serious stuff.
Yeah, and my hats are off to the designers that can pull that off too, honestly. Like, I'm a goofy person in my own personal life, but translating that into monster design or what have you, that never really occurs to me. When it does, I usually set it aside and go a different direction, and that's not always the right instinct, because, apparently sometimes that stuff really does work. It's generally not the kind of game I ever intend to set out to run, even though, it's hard to keep a game of D&D from getting goofy fairly frequently. But, it's never what you're aiming for, or at least I never am. It'll arrive there invariably. But yeah, I dig that kind of design when I see it pop up, and it's something that also works, There was a reject from, well, I shouldn't call it that. There was a creature that didn't make it into the final version of Tome of Beasts that I think was a backer submission that was, oh God, I probably shouldn't even talk about it. It was really hard to read it and tell whether or not the person was just completely screwing around altogether, or if it was like a teenager maybe who thought he found a really horrifying idea. And it was called the Crotch Mangler, and it was like shark teeth on legs, and it was about waist high. And I think the description of the thing said it pretty much all it wants to do is just mangle crotches. And it didn't make it into the final book.
Can't imagine why.
Yeah, right. But I mean, I was one of the people that did the judging on which ones were going to. And it did generate a fair amount of internal conversation, though, before we moved on. But a lot of that was just like, are they being serious? Is somebody just kind of completely joking around with us with their submission? But yeah, and so it doesn't always work, at least, wind up in a finished product. But so it's not always easy to get stuff like that right.
Well, and it's also interesting to see, like that was one of my favorite parts about the backer monster submissions. It was interesting to see common themes, because even though we got like 500 different creatures from different backers, I want to say about a third of them involved some type of, I'm going to stick an egg in you and it's going to kill you and burst and babies are going to come out.
Wow.
And I was like, what is people's obsession with, like, yeah. I mean, because if you look at the base monster manual, there's only one creature that does that, and that's the Slod.
Yeah.
And I'm like, people are really, really obsessed with this. Like, were all of these backers like really big fans of the Aliens franchise? Is that what this is, right?
Yeah. Was there a new movie out I didn't catch in the Aliens franchise right then?
Right. So we ended up keeping one of them, and it ended up being the Flesh Hornet, or I think it's Flesh Hornet or something like that. And so we kept that one, but I was just surprised at how like obsessed people were with that in their monster design. And then the other obsession that I saw a lot was creatures that took control of players. And for me, that's one of my big no-nos. Like, I like dominate person, dominate monster. That's one thing. It's a spell. You can resist it, whatever. But as far as just straight up taking control of, I'm generally not a fan of that, because it removes player agency. So I don't think any of those got in. I'm not entirely certain on that. But it is interesting to see like what's popular right now and what people like, as far as like what's trending and stuff. Because I know one of Chris's monsters, the Vampire Thrall, is basically the idea of, it's in that pop culture thing of when you see the scene in, well, I don't know, I'm dating myself by mentioning the Blade movie, I guess, but in vampire movies, right, where you have the I guess posse of humans that are like, oh, one day I'll be turned. And so they drink some of the blood, or they pretend like they drink blood, or they dress like the vampire and they hang out with the vampire. And they're basically walking blood bags for the vampire. And the vampire's like, yeah, sure, I'll totally turn you one day, and then never actually do it. When Chris created a creature that was like that, right? So that's pulling, instead of on folklore, that's pulling more on kind of, I don't want to say modern folklore, but more modern mythos that people have kind of created around the whole, I guess, romanticizing of vampires. So you've got the
I can date myself even further on that very creature if it might make you feel better. What was that 80s horror movie with Roddy McDowell?
I think you're thinking of Vampire Hunter Los Mortis, starring John Bon Jovi.
No, wait, it's Fright Night.
Oh,
it was Fright Night. Yeah, there was one of those guys in Fright Night who was kind of the manservant of the vampire that lived there. And then going back further, Renfield to some degree, although we only get to see Renfield and Dracula once, he's locked up and sad. But yeah, and then in pop culture, and I know in the vampire games I've not gotten to play since like 1990 something. That's a big thing that they even have a term for it, and I can't think of what it is. But they are these walking blood bag kind of wannabe vampires that hangers on and servants and run around in the daytime for them.
Yeah, I will say I love our spread of vampires in the Creature Codex because of that. You've got the Thrall, and then you've got the Patrician that looks straight up like he's out of Castlevania.
Yeah. No, that is a really good spread. I really like the art for the Priestess. That's fun stuff. And there was, I had written up a little handful of things to throw in there too, but they were very Midgard specific, and wound up being, I think there's a...
is it the Shroud Eaters you're talking about?
Yeah, the Shroud Eaters.
It ended up, instead of being another type of vampire, because we already had 4, I think, we ended up doing it as a sidebar to kind of explain like how vampires work in Midgard, because they are a little bit different, I guess, mechanically and lore-wise. But that's hard to bring into the actual mechanics of a creature, the whole being like tied to a sire and all of that stuff. That's more of a kind of a lore thing, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I remember at the time, I was like, no. But at the end of the day, that sidebar was pretty much perfect. I do highly recommend the Midgard setting. But yeah, it's something that would be pretty much of use to you with that setting, and maybe not so much otherwise. But you can expand on it if you are going with the Midgard setting quite a bit.
Well, I think that is going to do it for this episode of Tabletop Babble. But before we go, where can people find you, Chris?
Let's see. I can be found on Twitter. I'm slowly sort of involving that in my life. Late adopter. It's at CH Game Designer. And let's see, I can be found on Facebook, although, primarily there, you'll find me on the Kobold Press page there. We have I like to think a very interactive site there for questions, answers, whatnot. You have designers jumping in to answer questions constantly on there.
Cool. And Meagan, where can you be found?
I am also relatively new to Twitter. I don't really use it too much. I do a lot of heart clicking, so that's something. I guess that counts.
That feature's going away, but
dang it! Now what am I gonna do? I'm just gonna be like, oh, that's cool, and not be able to tell the people. Goodness.
Yeah, I'm supposed to copy paste or something.
Right.
Yeah.
But I am at GM, as in Game Master Moonwolf.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today on Tabletop Babble. Everybody, that was a great conversation. Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and you can help us grow. If you head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star review, I will credit you, and you can make me say anything you want, because I'll read your review out loud verbatim, like Richard K.L., who left a review entitled A Great Resource. James gets guests from all across the tabletop gaming industry to talk about anything and everything. This show is a great resource to get a broad view of what's going on and hear from the people making the things we love to play. Thank you, Richard K.L. I wonder, could you be the amazing game designer of Descent into Midnight, Richard Kreutz Landry? I guess we'll never know. All right, people, if you want to learn more about me, I'm on Twitter at James Introcaso, and you can check out my blog, worldbuilderblog.com. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by BattleBonds. Don't forget that RPGs are like sex. Share it with someone you care about. Hey, everybody, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Elderwood Academy. Elderwood Academy are artisans who craft amazing products, including dice towers, dice trays, dice boxes, deck boxes, dice, and more. All products are crafted to look like spellbooks, scroll cases, codexes, and other awesome fantasy gear that we love. You can check it out. I have 2 of their boxes. They are amazing. Recently got a dice tray. That is also awesome. Looks like a scroll case. Unroll it. Bada bing, bada boom. Snaps together real quick. And bam, you are ready to roll some dice at the table with your own personal tray. Love it. It is beautiful. It's got this dragon inlay. Oh, man, it's so good. You can check out all of the designs on their website. Head to elderwoodacademy.com/don't-split. That's elderwoodacademy.com/don't-split. And start shopping for holiday gifts for all of the amazing gamers in your life.